In the early 90s, there was a back room at Nintendo's headquarters in Kyoto, Japan that served two different purposes. Primarily, it was the room in which Star Fox was being made, or at least where the bulk of its programming was happening anyway. But unofficially, it had also become a favourite spot for some of Nintendo's top minds to take their smoking breaks. Why this room in particular? Well, other than being a fairly discreet place to enjoy a cigarette, there were three guys working inside that were really worth seeing in action. Hilariously, none of them smoked and actually found it quite annoying that everyone else would, but that's not what made them such a novelty to be around. You see, these three, just teenagers at the time, were Star Fox's lead programmers. That's no small feat either. This would be the very first console game in the world to offer accelerated 3D graphics. This is 1992 we're talking about. Back then, if you wanted a 3D model in your game, at least on a console, an artist would usually need to draw each different angle of that model by hand. That's not how Star Fox was going to work. They were converting 3D wireframes into 2D images automatically. This is revolutionary stuff. These teenagers are schooling Nintendo on how to use their own hardware, because yes, that's the other thing, they weren't even Nintendo employees. They weren't Japanese either. They had been contracted from a tiny company in the UK called Argonaut Software. And if that sounds unusual, it's because it was. At this point in time, the Nintendo Japan office consists almost entirely of Japanese employees. How did three British teenagers end up working here and on such an important project too? Well, to understand that, you need to know the story of Dylan Cuthbert. 2 years ago, before starting work on Star Fox, at the age of 17, God, that's 10 years younger than I am right now, his boss at Argonaut set him the task of hacking Nintendo's new handheld device, the Game Boy. Cuthbert was told to break through its copyright protection, reverse engineer the console, and then figure out a way to make it run a real-time 3D game, something that had never been done before. And he was 17. 17.
And we basically just tried to put 3D engines onto anything that came into our hands, you know. I think that's probably, like, at that time, that was kind of Argonaut's policy, even.
Cuthbert does what he's told to do and creates a demo for the very first proper 3D game on the Game Boy. It's got movement inspired by Ball Blazer for the Atari, although this wasn't a sports game. You're driving around as a space tank shooting at things, and those things are three-dimensional objects, as is the tank you're driving. People start taking notice. Argonaut very quickly secure a publisher for the game. At the time it's called Eclipse, later on Lunar Chase, and really that should be the end of the story. It gets released, people buy it, some of them like it, some of them don't. The end. Except no, that's not the end of the story. Not quite. Because the boss of Argonaut Software is a man called Jez San, and he's young and very ambitious. He takes the demo, without telling Cuthbert that he's doing this, by the way, to the Consumer Electronics Show in America. There was no E3 back then. And manages to blag his way into a meeting with a representative from Nintendo. He pulls out his Game Boy running Cuthbert's 3D demo and says, "Hey, I bet you didn't think anybody was doing this." And from that point, things start snowballing. Jez San and Dylan Cuthbert are both flown over to Japan within 2 weeks of that meeting at CES. Business class, of course, because Nintendo are trying to impress them. When they get there, there's another meeting planned. This time the two of them are demoing the game in front of something like 30 Nintendo employees, all wearing matching uniforms. Miyamoto was part of that group, as was Gunpei Yokoi, the designer of the Game Boy they just hacked. Imagine giving that presentation. But of course, it goes well. Nintendo decide that they, in fact, will be acquiring the rights to this new Game Boy game, even if it does already have a publisher. They'll just need to make a very generous offer to ensure that goes through smoothly. That game, by the way, would go on to receive yet one more title before being released in a couple of years' time, only in Japan. It was called X. However, this meeting in Japan is not just about the Game Boy. There was an ulterior motive. Nintendo also wanted to show Argonaut something else, the Super Nintendo. San and Cuthbert became some of the first people from outside of Japan to see Super Mario World actually being played, although apparently it was quite buggy at the time. But more than that, Nintendo wanted to get their take on two other games, F-Zero and Pilotwings, both of which offered their own pseudo 3D graphics, but with severe limitations. Nintendo had aspirations for their new console to support a real 3D engine, and they wanted to know, could Argonaut make that happen?
Jez goes, well, I know this guy who makes custom chips. Let me call him right now. And so he picks up the phone in the corner of the meeting room and just basically called directly to the UK and talked to Ben Cheese directly and discussed whether it could be possible or not. And basically that's where the whole thing got born.
It's a fantastic idea. Because the chip is inside the cartridge and not the console, anyone with a Super Nintendo could benefit from this. Now here's a cool bit of trivia. If you open up one of these cartridges, as long as it's a game that has the SuperFX chip included, like Starwing here, which is the European name for Star Fox. Take that off and probably lose the screws. Right here, and you can see it really clearly, you can actually see the SuperFX chip. And on the front there, it's labeled Mario Chip 1. Now Mario in this case is actually an acronym for Mathematical Argonaut Rotational Input and Output. I can see why they stuck with SuperFX, it's a bit catchier. But a nice bit of trivia for Argonaut fans there. While Cuthbert is busy working on X, the chip begins production, and around the time that a prototype for that chip just starts to become available is around the time that Cuthbert finishes working on the game, and so he jumps over to a new team that's been set up to create a 3D game for the SNES using that new capability. Quite simply, Argonaut has more experience working with chips like this and can actually make a 3D game for the Super Nintendo quicker than Nintendo can. And so they start work on a title they were going to call SNESglider, a homage to another Argonaut game called STARGLIDER that released in the mid-80s. The problem was that it wasn't so good. The game was being designed by a bunch of programmers that were more interested in making cool 3D graphics and experimenting with this new chip they've got than actually making a game that was fun, that people would want to play. Cuthbert remembers showing it to Miyamoto for the first time and hearing him take a sharp intake of breath. It's not a good sign. Sure, Argonaut may have the technical expertise, but they would need Nintendo's designers.
So all the games that I'd played until that point, like on the Spectrum or the Amiga, pretty much just like had everything thrown in, and you weren't really expected to complete the game, you were just like expected to experience it.
There's a Japanese word, merikari, which traces its etymology back to the musical world, where it refers to the lowering and raising of pitch within a melody. For music to remain interesting for the listener, it needs a good balance of highs and lows. It can't be just one single note throughout. This, Cuthbert told me, is how Miyamoto talked about game design. You don't need to just chuck all your best ideas in at the start. Think about the beginning, the middle, the end. Oh, and we're not going to call it SNESglider. So it was decided that Cuthbert, along with two other Argonaut programmers, Giles Goddard and Krista Womble, should move to Kyoto full-time. They were clearly very talented at working with this new tech and full of experimental gameplay ideas, but they needed direction. The real core of the game's design would come to Miyamoto at the start of the new year, as he was taking part in Hatsumode, a Japanese tradition which involves visiting a local Shinto shrine. He lived near the Kyoto shrine of Fushimi Inari, famous for its gates, of which it has around 10,000. It takes about 2 hours to walk through them all. As he was walking up the path towards the heart of the shrine, which is dedicated incredibly to Inari Okami, the Japanese kami of foxes, Miyamoto imagined what it would be like to fly between the gates as a 3D experience. When the Argonaut programmers returned from their Christmas break, he told them he knew what this game should be now. A fast-paced flight simulator, not a realistic one of course, but something exhilarating, in which you're swooping between gates and avoiding obstacles and enemies and laser fire. And so for the next 10 or 11 months, which is all it took to create the original Star Fox, Cuthbert, Goddard and Womble would continue to lead the way on the technical side of this game, whilst Nintendo honed its design. For three rather headstrong teenagers, this dynamic sometimes proved a little frustrating.
You know, we were really, at that age, we were suddenly, you know, thrust into like a company like Nintendo and kind of showing up the other programmers in the you know, the around us, and so that kind of definitely went to our heads a little bit. But we were always very, you know, we weren't too rude, I suppose.
The original vision for Star Fox had the game set in an open 3D space, but it was Miyamoto that pushed for the game to actually be an on-rail shooter, recognizing that this would give them some serious advantages in terms of level design and pacing. He was also very hands-on with the controls.
That would be like, you know, Miyamoto having his mid-afternoon smoking break or whatever, and using that as an excuse to actually make the game better. So
I just can't imagine Miyamoto smoking. My mind refuses to form that image. Anyway, I'm told that he gave up the habit shortly after the release of Star Fox, and Nintendo even ended up banning smoking within the office, which I'm sure at least the Argonaut guys appreciated. Following the game's release, they all end up doing different things, with only Cuthbert going on to work with the game's sequel, Star Fox 2. Poor guy. But for a while, the three of them helped teach Nintendo how to program for their own console. And to Nintendo's credit, it's not like they were too proud to recognize that. In 2011, Miyamoto and Cuthbert are reunited for an interview, and here is a quote from the Japanese designer. So this is Miyamoto talking about Dylan Cuthbert. "I was surprised that he could handle programming at that age, that he could work a regular job when so young. I thought, oh, so that's what kind of world this industry is. The first thing I thought when I met Dylan-san was that this isn't a field in which you can get puffed up simply by being older. I quite like that as a message to end on, I think. Yeah, you can't get too proud just because you're older. Although, I mean, he was 17. 17! No, it's fine. And as ever, thank you to everyone who supports People Make Games over on Patreon. Even if you're 17, that's cool too. Without you, we couldn't make the show. So cheers very much, and we'll see you next time. Bye.